Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Patriot's History of the United States. I'm Patriot's History co-author Larry Swikart, along with Mike Allen, and I am your host here for this series where we're reading through Patriot's History of the United States. Remember, I'm using the 15th anniversary edition. If you have an earlier edition, it won't always track well, especially if it's before the 10th anniversary edition. Page numbers are going to be off, but usually the headers will be correct. Well, when we come to a document, such as the John Calhoun statement on nullification in South Carolina, we take our time here and actually read that document. So we came to the veto of the Bank of the United States by Andrew Jackson. Now, I will discuss some of the details of this later, but here is our introduction to this from Patriot's History Reader, and it's on page 126 of the veto of the Bank of the United States, Andrew Jackson, 1832. In many respects, President Jackson's poor versus rich veto of the bill to issue a charter to the Second Bank of the United States defined his presidency. Neither the House nor the Senate was able to override the veto, and with Jackson winning re-election to another term in the fall, the Bank of the United States was dead in all but name. In many ways, this was a populist victory over wealthy interests, but the bank made its reappearance in 1913 as the Federal Reserve Bank, again a private corporation, but one functioning without oversight either by Congress or the executive branch, and as was exercised on the Bank of the United States. Interestingly enough, a Democrat President, Jackson, killed the bank in 1832, and a Democrat President, Woodrow Wilson, with a straight party line vote in Congress, created the Federal Reserve. Well, let me clarify that a little. Wilson didn't create the Fed. He signed the law that Congress created the Fed. So he's generally credited or blamed with the Fed, but the Fed was created long before Wilson. He just was the guy who got his signature on the bill. Although power politics aimed at the bank's president, Nicholas Biddle, played a part in Jackson's opposition, there was also fear that foreign interests might soon control the bank and use it for hostile purposes. In fact, little evidence ever surfaced that the foreign interests sought to control or influence either the two national banks. The charter of the First Bank of the United States expired in 1811. For a century, historians blamed the demise of the bank for the credit expansion of 1833 through 36 and the subsequent panic in 1837. But in the late 1960s, research by Peter Timmon laid that view to rest by showing that somewhat natural causes, the production of silver followed by a sudden halt, sparked both the inflation and the panic. Jackson may have acted without cause, but his veto had little economic effect. Jackson's criticism of the bank seemed to resemble modern concerns over secrecy and power of the Federal Reserve System. Yet his arguments were not entirely honest. His attempt to deprive the Whigs of a major source of patronage and remove potential political enemies counted for as much as his arguments against the national bank. Nonetheless, the United States proceeded to become the world's greatest economic power without a central bank, and Jackson would undoubtedly consider that as a vindication of his position. Central banking systems make favored bankers extremely wealthy and powerful. Yet it was Jackson's party, supposedly the populists, that eventually reinstalled one in the United States. And I will go further here and say it was Jackson's pet banks who got rich when he killed the Bank of the United States. As I said when reading last time, this has nothing to do with Jackson hating banks or when he wanted to put in his own bank in place of the BUS. And he asked in 1829 his Treasury Secretary Woodbury to look into exactly that. How do we create a new national bank that won't be run by the Whigs? So, President's veto message regarding Bank of the United States, July 10, 1832. And this is a, wow, this is a long one. The bill to modify and continue an act entitled an act to incorporate the subscribers to the Bank of the United States was presented to me on 4th of July instant, having considered it with that solemn regard to the principles of the Constitution, which the day was calculated to inspire, and to come to the conclusion that it ought not to become a law, I herewith return it to the Senate, in which it originated, with my objections. Present corporate body, denominated by president, directors, and company of the Bank of the United States, will have existed at a time. This act is entitled to take effect 20 years. It enjoys an exclusive privilege of banking under the authority of the general government, a monopoly of the favor and support, and a necessary consequence, almost a monopoly of the foreign and domestic exchange. The powers, privileges, and favors bestowed upon it in the original charter, by increasing the value of the stock far above its par value, operated as a gratuity of many millions of stockholders. So he's trying to say, oh, these people got rich through the bank. Well, they gambled, and they gambled on the right thing. An apology may be found for the failure to guard against this result. Well, why should you guard against the result of people getting rich if they make wise investment decisions, especially in a bank that was favored by all of the local bankers and country bankers and did the country such a service? This is Jackson being a little toadstool. An apology may be found for the failure to guard against this result, in the consideration of the effect of the original act of the incorporation could not certainly be foreseen at the time of the passage. The act before me proposes another gratuity to the holders of the same stock, and in many cases to the same men, of at least 7 millions more. The donation finds no apology in any uncertainty as to the effect of this act. Again, there's no need for an apology. Every monopoly and all exclusive privileges are granted at the expense of the public, which ought to receive a fair equivalent. That's true. Every time you give somebody a monopoly, somebody else is hurt. The many millions which this act, and by the way, the way to fix it, Andrew, was not to ban the BUS or get rid of the BUS. It was to take away that monopoly power by allowing banks everywhere to engage in branch banking. That would have solved your problem. But oh no, he didn't like banks enough to do that. If we must have such a corporation, why should not the government sell out the whole stock and thus secure to the people the full market value of its privileges granted? Are you kidding me? He's saying, well, if it's such a good thing, we ought to sell all the government stock. The government owned stock precisely because it wanted to have some control and authority over the Bank of the United States. It's the whole reason for having stock in the first place. So you're saying, well, the government ought to give up all of its control and authority over the central bank. No national bank in the world has ever or has since ever done that. That's just absurd. But anyway. Why should not Congress create and sell 28 millions in stock, incorporating purchasers with all the powers and privileges secured in this act and putting the premium upon sales into the Treasury? But this, because the Treasury doesn't own that stock, you're selling it to private individuals. But this act does not permit competition in the purchase of this monopoly. It seems to be predicated on an erroneous idea that present stockholders have a prescriptive right not only to favor but to the bounty of government. No, it doesn't. It appears that more than a fourth part of the stock is held by foreigners, untrue, that reside is held in a few hundred of our own citizens, chiefly of the richest class. Well, ditch diggers aren't going to hold stock. They don't have enough money to buy stock. I mean, this is just, it's insane classist Marxist language. For their benefit, does this act exclude the whole American people from competition in the purchase of this monopoly and dispose of it for many millions less than it was worth? I cannot perceive the justice or policy of this course. Modifications of the existing charter proposed by this act are not such, in my view, as to make it consistent with the rights of the states or the liberties of the people. Why not? We had monopolies everywhere, thousands of them, well, maybe hundreds by this time. He isn't taking aim at any of those monopolies. Every hospital, every church was a monopoly. It was a grant. The modifications of the existing charter, I should say, every church and hospital was a charter. Some businesses like Charles River Bridge had, they thought, a monopoly power. Others didn't. All the objectionable principles of the existing corporation and most of the odious features are retained without alleviation. Fourth section secures state banks a legal privilege in the Bank of the United States, which is withheld from all private citizens. If a state bank in Philadelphia owe the Bank of the United States and have notes issued by the St. Louis branch, it can pay the debt with those notes. But if a merchant, mechanic, or other private citizen be in like circumstances, he cannot by law pay his debt in those notes, but must sell them at a discount or send them to St. Louis to be cashed. Yes, that is because it cost a bank money to bundle up all of the notes from the Bank of St. Louis and ship them overland to the Bank of St. Louis. We're talking about a discount of 0.5% to 1% of a dollar. So half a penny to a penny on a dollar to do this transaction. This is what he's complaining about. The boom conceded to state banks, though not unjust in itself, is most odious because it does not measure out equal justice to the high and the low, the rich and the poor. It's not supposed to. A bank's job is to make a profit, just like any other company. That's the only purpose. Kids, are you listening to me? The only purpose of a company is not to pay health care for employees. It's not to engage in climate do-goodism. The only purpose of any company is to make a profit. If you don't make a profit, you do nothing else and you're out of business. But this shows you that Jackson had no concept of what it took to run a business. To the extent of its practical effect is the bond of the union among the banking establishments of the nation, erecting them into an interest separate from that of the people, and to its necessary tendency to unite the Bank of the United States and the state banks in any measure which may be thought conducive to their common interest. The 9th section of this act recognizes principles of worse tendency than any provision of the present charter. When by a tax on resident stockholders, the stock of this bank is made worth 10 or 15% more to foreigners and residents, most of it will inevitably leave the country. Was there any evidence this was happening? I've seen none. Thus will the provision of this practical effect derive from the eastern as well as the southern and western states the means of raising revenue from the extension of business and the great profits of this institution. Why did all the people from those regions support the bank? Dipwad. It will make the American people debtors to aliens in nearly the whole amount due this bank, sent across the Atlantic from 2 to 5 million specie every year to pay bank dividends. Again, absolutely unproven. It's a lie. Is there no danger to our liberty and independence in a bank that its nature has so little to bind it to the country? The president of the bank has told us that most of the state banks exist by its forbearance. Should its influence become concentrated as it may under the operation of such an act as this, in the hands of a self-elected directory whose interests are identified with those of foreign stockholders, will there not be cause to tremble for the purity of our elections in peace and for the independence of our country in war? Dude, you just asked to get rid of all the bank stock instead of letting the government keep the 1/5 that it had to control a bank. The courts which should be pursued by a bank almost wholly owned by the subjects of a foreign power and managed by those whose interests, if not affections, would run the same direction, there can be no doubt. Again, no proof. All its operations within would be in and of the hostile fleets and armies without, controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens in dependence. It would be more formidable and dangerous than the naval and military power of the enemy. If that was true, why was it the U.S. continually got richer while we had the BUS from the 1820s to 1833? And then all of a sudden we go into depression when there is no more bank. I know, the Mexican silver, it's a very important issue. But nevertheless, the BUS contributed to rising prosperity for all people, and Jackson wanted to get rid of that. We must have a bank with private stockholders, every consideration of sound policy, and every impulse of American feeling admonishes that it should be purely American. Why? I mean, why? If you own Ford, don't you want to sell stock in England, Germany, Japan, right? What do you care who the stockholders are as long as you own a majority control? Well, the U.S. government owned a majority control until Jackson wanted to take it away. The original Act of Incorporation, Section 21, enacts that, quote, that no other bank shall be established by any future law of the United States during continuance of the corporation hereby created, for which the faith of the United States is hereby pledged, provided Congress may renew existing charters for banks within the District of Columbia, not increasing the capital thereof, and may also establish any other bank or banks in the district with capitals not exceeding in the whole $6 million, they shall deem it expedient. This provision is continued in force by an act before me 15 years from the ad of March 1836. If Congress possessed the power to establish one bank, they had the power to establish more than one, if in their opinion 2 or more banks had been necessary to facilitate the execution of the powers delegated them in the Constitution. Yes, they did, but they can't establish 2 if they gave this bank a monopoly power. That's called breaking a contract, breaking a covenant. God doesn't look favorably on breaking covenants. If they possess the power to establish a second bank, it was a power derived from the Constitution to be exercised from time to time and at any time when the interests of the country or the emergencies of the government might make it expedient. It was possessed by one Congress as well as another by all the Congresses alike and alike at every session, but the Congress of 1816 have taken it away from their successors for 20 years. That's what the first one did. And the Congress of 1832 proposed to abolish it for 15 years more. It's actually less than the first 2. They may properly use the discretion vested on them, but they may not limit the discretion of their successors. This restriction on themselves and grant of monopoly to the bank is therefore unconstitutional. In another point of view, this provision is a palpable attempt to amend the Constitution by act of legislation. The Constitution declares that the Congress shall have power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over the District of Columbia. Its constitutional power, therefore, to establish banks in the District of Columbia and increase their capital at will is unlimited and uncontrollable by any other power than that which gave authority to the Constitution. If this act declares that Congress shall not increase the capital of existing banks nor create other banks with capitals exceeding the whole $6 million. Dude, Congress has authority over the District of Columbia. They can establish banks or not establish banks as they want to there. This guy is dense. The Constitution declares that the Congress may have the power to exercise exclusive legislation over the district in all cases whatsoever, and this act declares they shall not. No, it did just the opposite. It said they shall, which is the supreme law of the land. This provision cannot be necessary or property or constitutional unless the absurdity to be admitted that whenever it be necessary and property in the opinion of Congress, they have the right to barter away one portion of the powers vested in them by the Constitution as a means of executing the rest. They do that all the time. And it's up to the Supreme Court to go, yeah, you can do that. No, you can't. They do that in everything all the time. On 2 subjects only does the Constitution recognize Congress the power to grant exclusive privileges or monopolies. It declares that Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. Out of this express delegation of power have grown the laws of patents and copyrights. As a Constitution expressly delegates to Congress the power to grant exclusive privileges in these cases as a means of executing the substantive power to promote the progress of science and useful arts, it is consistent with the fair trade of the construction to conclude that such a power is not intended to be granted as a means of accomplishing any other end. On every other subject which comes within the scope of the constitutional power, there is an congressional power, there is an ever-living discretion in the use of the proper means which cannot be restricted or abolished without an amendment to the Constitution. Well, the problem is until 1837, which is 5 years later, the Supreme Court had not ruled that. The Supreme Court had not yet ruled that a charter does not imply a monopoly. Quite the contrary. Up to Charles River Bridge v. Warren Bridge, 1837, courts had held that charters were a monopoly. So Jackson is just off his rocker here. Every act of Congress, therefore, which attempts to grant monopolies or sale of exclusive privileges for a limited time or a time without limit to restrict or extinguish its own discretion of choice means to execute the delegated powers is equivalent to a legislative amendment of the Constitution and palpably unconstitutional. No, it's not. It's totally in keeping with everything that has happened up to that point. Government of the United States has no constitutional power to purchase lands within the states, except for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings, and even for these objects only by the consent of the legislature of the state, in which shall be the same. By making themselves stockholders in the bank and granting the corporation the power to purchase lands for other purposes, it's a private company. It's not the government doing the purchase. They assume a power granted the Constitution, grant others they do not themselves possess. It is not necessary to the receiving, safekeeping, transmission, the funds of the government that the bank should possess this power, and it is not proper that Congress should enlarge the powers delegated to them in the Constitution. They didn't. The old Bank of the United States possessed a capital of only $11 million, which was found fully sufficient to enable it to dispatch safely, perform all the functions required of it by the government. Capital of the present bank is $35 million. Inflation, does that ring a bell? The country's only gotten like 3 times bigger with the Louisiana Purchase. There's more need for bank capital. I mean, every step of the way here, Jackson is proving himself to be not very bright. And certainly, having been in the Senate, and I think he was a judge before, not having common sense about what the law actually says. At least 24 more than the experience has proved to be necessary to enable a bank to perform its public functions. The public debt, which existed during the period of the old bank and on the old establishment of the new, has been nearly paid off, and our revenue will soon be reduced. The increase of capital is therefore not for the public, but for private purposes. The bank's capital had nothing to do with the national debt. Whatever the bank's capital was or what its debts were, it was a private company. It had 20% controlled by the government, only as a way to make sure it was going the right direction, but it was a private company. Government has no business telling a private company how much debt it can or cannot have. Principle laid down, the Supreme Court concedes that Congress cannot establish a bank for purposes of private speculation and gain, but only as a means for executing delegated powers of the general government. It is maintained by some that the bank is a means of executing constitutional power, quote, to coin money and regulate the value thereof. Congress have established a mint to coin money and passed laws to regulate the value thereof. The money so coined with its value so regulated and such foreign coins as Congress may adopt are the only currency known to the Constitution. That is a very narrow interpretation. Since then, most states had agreed that paper money was money. Notes are notes. That gold does not work to be a national medium of exchange. If you think it does, you go try to pay your grocery bill in Kruger Inn sometime. See how far that gets you. Even if they could take it, they couldn't make change. And believe me, I've seen these small change notes, these little things the size of a postage stamp, that have like 1/10 of an ounce of gold or something worth 50 cents or whatever it is. You can't do that. It's just preposterous. Paper money exists because it is portable, fungible. You can make change. I mean, it exists for a lot of reasons, and the same reason that gold and silver have not become circulating medium, because they're not convenient. Okay. But if they have the power to regulate currency, it's conferred to be exercised by themselves and not transferred to a corporation. If the bank be established for that purpose with a charter unalterable without its consent, Congress a part of their power for a term of years, during which the Constitution is a dead letter, it is neither necessary nor proper to transfer its legislative power to a bank and therefore unconstitutional. Here's the deal. The bank had to convert its notes into gold or silver specie. That's part of its charter. Part of every bank's charter at this time was you had to take bank notes, and if somebody wanted gold or silver and said, I don't trust your notes, pay me silver dollars, you had to do it, or you were out of business. Same thing with the Bank of the United States. Well, who coins the silver and gold? Congress. So ultimately, the bank still had to rely on the minting power of Congress. It didn't take over the minting power. Again, Jackson's just being obstinate here. Upon the formation of the Constitution, states granted their taxing power with peculiar jealousy. They surrounded it only as regards imports and exports in relation to every other object within their jurisdiction, whether persons, property, business, or professions. It was secured in an ample manner as was before possessed. All persons through United States officers are liable to a poll tax by the states within which they reside. The lands of the United States are liable to the usual land tax, except in new states, from whom agreements that they will not tax unsold lands are exacted when they are admitted to the Union. Horses, wagons, any beasts or vehicles or tools, property belonging to private citizens, though employed in the service of the United States, are subject to state taxation. Every private business, whether carried on by the officer of the general government or not, whether it be mixed with public concerns or not, even if it be carried on by the government of the United States itself separately or in partnership, falls within the scope of the taxing power of the state. Nothing comes more fully within it than banks and business of banking, by whomsoever instituted and carried on. Over this whole subject matter, it is just an absolute, unlimited, uncontrollable, as if the Constitution had never been adopted, because of the formation of that instrument, it was reserved without quantification. He's trying to argue the banks are levying a tax on you because they can change the value of money. No, they can't. They can't print more notes. But if they do, and they can't convert them into gold and silver, they are shut down. It's in every state law out there. So no, they can't exact a tax. Remember, you don't have to take BUS notes if you don't want to either. Principles conceded states cannot rightfully tax the operation of general government. They cannot tax the money of the government deposited in the state banks, nor the agency of those banks in remitting it. But will any man maintain that their mere selection to perform this public service for the general government would exempt state banks and their ordinary business from state taxation? Has the United States, instead of establishing a bank in Philadelphia, employed a private banker to keep and transmit the funds? Would it have deprived Pennsylvania of the right to tax his bank and his usual banking operations? Well, no, if it's not acting as an aspect of the federal government, would not. We saw that in McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819, where the branch of the BUS could not be taxed by the state of Maryland. So that's already been established. I don't know what Jackson's doing railing against that. I'm jumping down a little bit. Is it not their public agency or the deposits of the government which states have a right to claim a right to tax, but the banks and their banking powers instituted and exercised within state jurisdiction for their private emolument those powers and privileges for which they pay a bonus and which the states tax in their own banks? It cannot be necessary to the character of the bank as the fiscal agent of the government that its private businesses should be exempt from that taxation of which all state banks are liable, nor can I conceive it proper that the substantive and most essential powers reserved by the state shall be that thus attacked and annihilated as a means of executing the powers delegated to the general government. Congress established this. Congress gets to say if it's to be taxed or not, because it's an act of Congress. Jackson's going around in circles here. Let's jump down. If our power over means is absolute, that the Supreme Court will not call into question constitutionality of an act of Congress in the subject which is not prohibited and is readily calculated to affect any of the objects entrusted to the government, although, as in the case before me, it takes away powers expressly granted to Congress and rights scrupulously reserved to the states, it becomes us to proceed in our legislation with the utmost caution. Though not directly our powers and the rights of the states may be indirectly legislated away in the use of means to execute substantive powers, we may not enact that Congress shall not have the power to exclusive legislation of the District of Columbia, but we may pledge the faith of the United States that as a means of executing other powers it shall not be exercised for 20 years or forever. We may not pass an act prohibiting the states to tax the banking business carried on within their limits, but we may, yes, you can. McCulloch versus Madison. I'm sorry, McCulloch versus Marbury. I'm sorry, I'm tired. McCulloch versus Maryland. Marbury, Madison, McCulloch, Maryland. Thus may our own powers and the rights of the states, which we cannot directly curtail and invade, be frittered away and extinguished in the use of means employed by us to execute our powers. Under such circumstances, the bank comes forward and asks a renewal of the charter for a term of 15 years upon conditions that not only operate as a gratuity to the stockholders and many of the millions of dollars, which he said earlier, but will sanction any abuses and legalize any encroachments. Suspicions are entertained, charges are made of gross abuse and violation of its charter. Untrue. There was none of that going on. An investigation unwillingly conceded and so restricted in time as to necessarily make it incomplete and unsatisfactory discloses enough to excite suspicion and alarm. In other words, we couldn't find it. It's what they're trying to do to President Trump. We can't find anything, so we need to investigate further. Not finding anything is proof that there's something there. Absurd. Terrible. Jackson should have been ashamed of himself for this. In the practices the principal bank partially unveiled in the absence of important witnesses, numerous charges confidently made, like the Russia hoax, and as yet wholly unsubstantiated, he admits that, there is enough to induce a majority of the committee of the investigation, a committee which selected from the most able and honorable members of the House of Representatives, like the guys who did Trump's impeachment, like those honorable members, to recommend a suspension of further action upon the bill and prosecution of the inquiry. But they didn't do that. As the charter had yet 4 years to run, the renewal now was not necessary to the successful prosecution of the business. It was to have been expected that the bank itself, conscious of its purity and proud of its character, would have withdrawn its application for the president, demanded that the severest scrutiny into all of its transactions. Well, obviously, and we've been over this, Biddle and his allies thought that with an election coming, this is exactly the right time to try to recharter the bank because they thought Jackson wouldn't challenge it. They were wrong. In their declining to do so, there seems to be an additional reason why the functionaries of the government should proceed with less haste and more caution to the renewal of those of their monopoly. In other words, we didn't find anything yet, but the very fact we didn't find anything should lead you to withdraw your application so we can find something. Again, just shameful and stupid. The bank is professedly established as an agent of the executive branch of the government, and its constitutionality is maintained on that ground. Neither upon the property of present action nor upon the provisions of this act was the executive consulted. It has had no opportunity to say that it neither needs nor wants an agent clothed in such powers and favored by such exemptions. There's nothing in its legitimate function that makes it necessary or proper. Well, Congress said it was. Supreme Court said Congress gets to say. Whatever interest or influence, whether public or private, has given birth to this act, it cannot be found either in the wishes or necessities of the executive department, by which present action is deemed premature, and the powers conferred upon its agent not only unnecessarily but dangerous to the government and the country. It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Exactly what Jackson is doing in this message. Distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. Equality of talents, of education, of wealth cannot be produced by human institutions. Glad you admitted that, Andrew. In the full enjoyment of the gifts cannot be gifts of heaven and the fruits of superior industry, economy, and virtue. Every man is equally entitled to protection of the law when the law undertakes to add to these natural and just advantages artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, exclusive privileges to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful. The humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. There are no necessarily evils in government, and as heaven does its rains, shower its favors able alike on the high and on the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. In the act before me, there seems to be a wide and unnecessary departure from these principles. Experience should teach us wisdom. Most of the difficulties of our government now encounters, and most of the dangers which impend over our union, have sprung from an abandonment of the legitimate objects of government by our national legislation, by the adoption of such principles as are embodied in this act. Many of our rich men have not been content with equal protection and equal benefits, but have besought us to make them richer by act of Congress. It's time to pause in our career and review our principles, and if possible, revive the devoted patriotism and spirit of compromise which distinguish the sages of the Revolution, the fathers of our Union. I have now done my duty to this country. If sustained by my fellow citizens, I shall be grateful and happy. Excuse me. If not, I find in the motives which impel me ample grounds for the contentment and peace. In the difficulties which surround us and the dangers which threaten our institutions, there is cause for neither dismay nor alarm. For relief and deliverance, let us firmly rely on that kind providence, which I am sure watches with peculiar care over the destinies of our republic and on the intelligence and wisdom of our countrymen. Through his abundant goodness and patriotic devotion, our liberty and union will be preserved. So there you have it, Andrew Jackson's veto message, convoluted, horrible legal reasoning, logic, just really, really bad at every level. I wish I could say otherwise, but it's one of the reasons I am not a fan of Andrew Jackson. I think he way too often had these kinds of responses, emotional responses that weren't warranted, certainly by the Constitution or by the issue at hand, as you know, as we saw with the Indians. All right, that's it. I will see you guys back here on Friday. Remember, if you like this, buy Larry a coffee. I'll see you later.